This is tape 3 of an interview with Elvira Pfeffer. And we, in the last tape, spoke about your traveling from Czechoslovakia. You already had papers and all that you needed to be allowed to come to the United States. And so you traveled with your brother and your parents to England. And what happened when you came to England?
Well, we went to London, and in London, we really expected everything to be over, and this was just another stop on our way, and we expected to turn around and go back home soon. We did not have an apartment in England. My brother and I stayed in a youth hostel, in a youth home, with other children whose parents, I believe, were not in England. We were in a home of children who probably from Germany had, by that time, the parents had sent them away on their own. There was school there, and
was this an observant place?
Yes, it was definitely an observant place, and it's possible there was a Rabbi Schoenfeld who's very famous. I believe it was the institution that he ran, and I remember there were other children. I remember being able to communicate with them. They spoke the same language I did, which was German.
Yeah.
And I remember one thing that very vividly, and that's getting lice. And I remember what it took to get rid of it. And
what did it take?
Well, it took a lot of stuff, a lot more than it takes today, and it was very smelly, and I had to have my head wrapped up, and I guess I was kind of sort of quarantined, although I think everybody really had it. I got it from somebody else. A lot of my time, my brother, who is physically handicapped, always is a very independent and proud person. And from the time I was a little girl, I remember having to help him, but not letting him know that I was helping him. That was throughout our young years. And although he understood his studies very much, and I also liked to read by that time, I liked to learn, and I enjoyed there, although I did feel deprived, or I missed my parents very much. We did have wealthy relatives in London. Their name was Gestetner, and they are the printing press people that started it. However, they were not the oldest one. The grandfather was Orthodox. The rest of the family was not. My parents went to visit them, but there was not a whole lot of socializing. In other words, they didn't say, stay here, here's an apartment, whatever. They went to visit them, and I remember going once. But most of the time, I don't know, my parents spent really just looking around London, and I don't believe they expected to stay there. I think they expected either to go back or they didn't know what they were going to be doing next. And I do know that they really knew that the tempo of this thing was heating up on the other side, and that things were getting really a lot stricter as far as fulfilling the Germans' wishes. As far as they heard stories from people who came later and who were not in Czechoslovakia on the way, of what was going on there, and the definite feeling was that it was getting very serious, that it was not to be joked with. So we stayed 3 weeks in London, and then we took a boat. The name of the boat was Ile-de-France. I remember being on that boat. We were not in the best accommodations. I remember there was kosher food.
Were there many other
Yes.
Jews who were going away from Europe because
Yes,
of the
there
problems
were.
in
Yes,
Europe?
there were.
Did you know any of them from
I remember
home?
being friendly, familiar, but to tell you that I actually know someone that came over on the same boat as we did, I can't say that I did.
What did you do while you were on the boat? Do you remember that that trip on the boat?
I think there were children on the boat, and I think there were people that took care of children, you know, to see that they played properly and that they. I think the boat trip was probably 5 days from London to New York. Seemed to me that that's how long it was. It didn't go over a weekend, it didn't go over Shabbos, but it seemed to me that it was most of a week that it took to get to New York.
Well, what happened when you got to New York?
Well, I remember the Statue of Liberty,
Yes.
and I definitely remember going through Ellis Island.
What was it like going through Ellis Island?
I actually made my husband take me back about 2 years ago to go back there and see, and I remember going through the procedure where people ask you questions.
Was it difficult?
It was
for you?
difficult because you never knew if you were going to answer the question right that they were asking you. And, you know, anxious parents, when your parents are anxious, you feel it, whether they tell you they're anxious or not. And they can say, you know, don't worry, honey, but you definitely have a feeling that this is all new and strange. And that, don't forget, we were dealing with a new language in England that we were not familiar with, and these were people, my parents were in their 40s when we came over, and there was a lot of anxiety as to what exactly your life would be like once you got to where you were really going.
Once you were through Ellis Island, where did you go?
We had Landslight, who we knew how to contact. This rabbi, this Rav from our community, had just gotten to New York about probably 2 or 3 months before us.
What was his name again?
His name was Rabbi Levi Greenwald.
And he was from your...
He was from our town, and he was also related to us. And we went to his home. And we were really very comfortable there. And we thought about staying in New York. And he had established himself in Williamsburg, which became an enclave of Orthodoxy in America. As a matter of fact, this influx of Jewish people from Europe, even in 1939, started to make a change in the panorama in Brooklyn. There were new, one of his, he started to look into the degree of kashrut in Brooklyn, and they began, some of the people that came from where we came began new dairies, for instance, to make the dairy products more kosher. He began to look at the meat products that were available and began to enlarge and to change certain things about that. And he was really the very first one that came from Europe. Reason being that we came from Austria, which is the first place that was hit.
How long did you stay in New York?
We stayed in New York about 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, and we really, my father didn't have a profession, so he really didn't know what it was that he was going to do. He certainly was motivated not to beleaguer someone else with his economic, sustenance, and so he knew that he was going to have to do some kind of work. And the hearing that I remember hearing that, well, New York is full of people like you, so why don't you go west? And we had, our papers were from right near Pittsburgh, from Denora, Pennsylvania. and although we did meet up in New York with many of our Landsleit people that had come and who settled there and whose families we knew, and
You mean who settled in New York?
in New York, in Brooklyn, really. And it would have been nice to stay there, but the Rav encouraged us to go to where our papers were, and perhaps things would work out for us there.
Had you been in touch with Bob Hollander, the one who sponsored you?
Yes, he was in touch with us, and we were in touch with him. And he encouraged us to come, and he didn't seem at all frightened by the fact that a new family was coming, and he, he encouraged us both morally, and although we still had enough money to pay our own way. I remember we brought jewelry, and I remember giving them that we gave them certain jewelry when we arrived in Donora, PA.
Giving to whom?
To the family, to his wife and his mother-in-law, and it was a large family that he married into, a very warm, large family, and he, I believe, had children close to my age. We stayed there, although we couldn't stay there too long because although they thought they were very kosher, it was not up to our standards. My father and mother knew one thing, that they were absolutely not going to change their ways as far as their orthodoxy was concerned. I think the people that came earlier in the century had a more difficult time with that, but in 1939, people basically remained the way they were overseas. And their roots were very strong in their observances, that there was no thought even about working on Shabbos or not eating something that wasn't kosher, that we were definitely going to stick with that.
Well, then what was the decision of your father in terms of moving from the Hollander house?
We decided that Pittsburgh was a larger community, and possibly there were more people like us here than in Donora. Although in those days, the little towns around Pittsburgh seems, in a way, in retrospect now, to have had more of observant Judaism, like McKeesport always did, and Donora probably was, by this time, was maybe losing it, but people were losing interest in it, the next generation. But for a long time, they had a strong community. They had rabbis. I mean, I remember their names. They had shuls. And possibly because this family was not as observant as we are, maybe it was a little easier if we went a little farther away. Although my uncle, my mother's uncle, had his business in Pittsburgh, in Hazelwood, which is very close to Squirrel Hill.
What sort of business did he have?
He had a grocery store. He was quite successful. Some of their children lived in Pittsburgh, and they were a large family, and he helped us in any way that he could.
Where did you move to in Pittsburgh when you actually made the move?
Okay, well, I remember that the Hayas, or what we call today, I guess it's called the UJF today, or some arm of it. Then it was part of the Hayas. I remember them meeting us in New York and also helping us here. I remember that the forerunner of the Emma Kaufman Center in the Hill District, we moved to the Hill District. They found us a room. The first one was...
These were the highest people
yeah,
for your room?
The first place we moved to was Wick Street in the Hill District, which was pretty primitive compared to what we were used to. I remember we had one bed for the four of us, but for a short time, and it was like really a one-room thing. I remember the people's name that we lived with. Matter of fact, they remembered us when we were both ended up here in Squirrel Hill. That you're the people that lived in our house on Wick Street.
And how long did you stay in that house on Wick
Probably
Street?
no more than a few months. My parents started to look around for some work, something to do without language. I think the Highest tried to help as much as they could, giving ideas. And then, if you were observant, you looked for rabbis and you looked for people that of similar bent, and you went to them and you explained to them that you have no intention of not being Sabbath observant, and could they help you find something? Well, I definitely remember for that you had to come to Squirrel Hill, because by that time most of the rabbinic places and synagogues were in Squirrel Hill. The rabbis were all in Squirrel Hill. There were still synagogues in the Hill District. I remember them very distinctly. My father became very friendly, as a matter of fact, with Rabbi Leiter, Leiter, who was a very scholarly man, and he tried to encourage us and help us in any way that he could.
Was Rabbi Leiter the rabbi in the Hill District of
Yes,
the synagogue?
He was a rabbi in what they refer to as the Galicianer Shul. It's really the only one that's left standing on Wiley Avenue. I've taken my grandchildren to look at it and see it.
What was the name of that?
Galicianer. I don't remember the Hebrew name.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the others I remember the Hebrew names, but that particular one I just don't happen to remember. I know
What
there
was the
Hebrew
size of the Jewish community in the Hill District?
The Hill
at that
District
time?
was starting to lose the Jewish community. They were people. This was 1939,
Mm-hmm.
and people were moving to Squirrel Hill and to Oakland, and starting to leave the Hill District. Although Dinwiddie Street, which is a street that we moved to after Wick Street, was a beautiful street, and it was the Jewish community was still very much in evidence there.
Where did you go to school at that time?
I went to Miller School, and I remember growing up a big hill to go to school. I took my brother with me, and my
How
parents,
old were you when you
I was
arrived?
8, and my parents encouraged us. English was not hard for me to learn, and matter of fact, our parents learned English from us. We used to practice at night. They also went to school at night.
What was, how did you feel going into this school, this Miller School? Do you recall, do you have any memories of when you first arrived in Miller
Yes, it was strange
School?
at first, but I could tell you that within about 6 months, I got up to the grade I was supposed to be in, and then I started even going beyond that. It was strange. It was probably half black and half white by then, and I remember people were very nice to us, and I remember the children that we played with. I mean, some of them are, I know today in the community, we're friends here. We may have lost touch with each other for 10, 15 years. In the JCC, a girl works that I remember playing with across the street. I can tell you their names. I remember them. And Ray Felder, I remember from the Hill District. And a lot of our learning and our emotional stability came from the Emma Kaufman Center.
What did the Emma Kaufman Center represent for you at that time?
Well, they
What
had
did it do
social
for you?
workers, and there was a social worker that I remember, Mrs. Heldman, and I know a lot of people remember her too. And I remember they gave us passes and cards, and we were able to, I don't remember if it was swim or play ball or go to camp or whatever it was. We spent our days there. And then at home there was a lot of discussion about what my parents were going to do to earn a living. And at the very beginning, both my parents went door to door with suitcases selling notions, handkerchiefs and combs and I don't know, all kinds of things like that. Safety pins.
Where did they do this?
I don't think they went to Squirrel Hill. I think they went in the immediate territory. And after that, after talking, to different people, they graduated. My father was able to. The people at the Hebrew Free Loan remember my father. My husband was active, very active later on in the Hebrew Free Loan, and many of the people remember my father. I believe that he probably got a loan to buy a truck, and he got a driver because he learned to drive much later, and he had a driver, and he started huckstering fruit. So we would go down to Penn Avenue and load up the truck, and that
Would you do that with your father?
I don't remember Yes, I remember being in the truck. I went to school when he went to huckstering, but I remember other things. I remember, for instance, going down to Logan Street to buy yesterday's bread for 10 cents. And my mother, at that time, when we got a larger place, we took in some boarders from time to time, other people who had come over, and maybe their families weren't here yet, and so on. And then I don't remember her working at that time, but I'm sure she did something because my mother worked all her life. But by the time my father was in this huckstering business, and then someone suggested to him that he, on the way back from huckstering, that he pick up burlap bags.
From where?
From the feed stores. And so he started doing that, purchasing them, and that
What would he do with the bags?
Well, what they would do would be a kind of a primitive kind of a reprocessing. They would clean them. So my mother, by that time, we had some kind of a machine. We had a building on Robert Street, a little small building, and I think we already had an employee or so. My mother was definitely there. She sat at a machine and patched the holes. She learned how to sew, and then they would resell them, I think, to these feed places as well.
At that time, were you still going to Miller School?
Yes, I was definitely going to Miller School. And if you want to know what I do remember, I remember all of a sudden we had a great hailstorm, and I was with my brother, and I was really afraid that I wouldn't get to the bottom of the hill to get home. And I was really worried about him because he couldn't walk as well or as quickly as other people did. But we did make it, although it was very anxious, half hour or whatever it took. I remember at one other time when Friday morning my mother would want to spend a little more time at home baking or cooking for Shabbos. And so I was already a very mature child of 9 or so, and she gave me the keys to open the place up for the one or two workers that we had. And it was a snowy day, and I lost the keys in the snow. And remember looking for them and really being very, very, more than anxious. I was really terrified as to what was going to happen to those keys. And I don't know what the end of the story was, but it seemed like everything turned out okay at the end.
When you finished Miller School, where did you go from there?
I finished Miller School in 8th grade. I think in 6th grade. In 7th and 8th and 9th grades I spent at Fifth Avenue High School. And by that time we were already, I guess when you come you're green, and by that time we were yellow, I guess. I don't know.
While you were going to Fifth Avenue High School, what was the business situation with your father? Was he still doing the?
My father was
Was
in
he
the
still a
burlap.
huckster?
No, he was already in this burlap business, and I remember hearing the figure $7 a week is what he was earning, and I think that was pretty good at that time. My mother always saved something from it. She never spent it all.
Did either your father or your mother get into community affairs at that time at all, like either Zionist or
No, not at
Jewish
that time.
community?
No, not at that time. At that time, we were pretty much loners because I don't remember other people who were of the same age or that were truly very careful about what they ate or what they drank or what they did on Saturday. I remember Saturday being a very lonely day, and that I spent most of the time with my mother. And I had one friend who was actually, she went to her grandfather's on Shabbos. She lived on Reed Street, and she's completely non-observant now. She lives across the street from my mother, and I remember my mother saying that, you know, I should only be as religious as she is. Everything would be okay. I remember she took her religion very seriously, but it was a job keeping up with, there was a kosher butcher shop. I remember it. It was called Pechersky's. But some of the things that were available were not up to what we were used to eating or drinking.
Even through the Rabbi Leiter, you did not always find sources?
We checked with him, and I don't believe that in those particular days, I don't think anybody, other than the Irene Kaufman Center, we were that's a community thing, but in those days, I guess my parents were busy learning the language and busy just tired from working, and we didn't join really anything. And also, you have to remember that we were very concerned about our families in Europe. We certainly never forgot them. We followed the newspapers very closely. Matter of fact, my parents learned Yiddish here in order to keep up with that by learning to read Yiddish. And that's how we got letters from them, and we definitely had in mind that we had left everybody else there.
Did you get word from about any of your family in terms of war happenings?
We got word, but just for a short time, and after that the communication stopped.
Okay, we're coming to the end of this tape. We'll continue on the next one.